On the one hand, there were all these articles about how countries, including France, but also the US and other countries all over the world, have to start worrying about their pension systems. There is going to be more retirees collecting the benefits and they're living longer, but there's fewer and fewer workers who are paying into the system. The other issue was the rise of artificial intelligence, right? AI, and what is it going to do? It's going to start replacing knowledge workers, white-collar jobs are not safe anymore, and so on. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't there a contradiction between these two? On the one hand, we're saying we're not going to have enough workers, and that's a problem. On the other hand, we're saying we're not going to have enough jobs for the workers we have. And I'm thinking, if that's the problem that you have, why are you making people work longer?
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to be joined today by Associate Professor of Economics at Franklin and Marshall College and Research Scholar at the Levy Economics Institute, Professor Yeva Nersisyan. Hi, Yeva.
Hi, happy to be here.
We're recording this on a week where here in the UK, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, has identified a new cause of inflation, which is retirees. And he's warned that if people don't stop dropping out of the workforce, he may have to raise interest rates, which of course is designed to cause a rise in unemployment. So the solution to too many people dropping out of the workforce is to fire people already in the workforce while increasing interest income to people who already have money. Again, that's the Bank of England's plan to fight inflation. In the meantime, media pundits are wagging their fingers at French workers for simply not just quietly rolling over and giving up 2 extra years of their life to their employers just because their president has decreed it. And so pensions are in play for a new season of political football. And Yeva, you've been writing about the French situation and state pensions in general, or social security as it's called in the US. And you gave us an advanced look at an article of yours, so thanks for that. And it's entitled, "For a Truly Progressive Reform of Social Security, Follow Alan Greenspan, Not Bernie Sanders." Now, tell us all about that article.
Yeah. So progressives in the United States have coalesced around this idea that to save Social Security, our pension system, we have to raise the income cap on our payroll taxes. So in the US, there is a tax on wages, but it's capped at a certain level. So if you're making more than a certain amount, you don't pay any taxes. So in that sense, the tax is regressive, right? It's unfair. And so Bernie and others are saying, well, to save Social Security, to make sure that it's funded for another 75 more years, we have to lift this cap. And it's true that technically you would fund it for 75 more years or something like that if you lift the cap. But what I'm arguing in that piece is that this is short-sighted, right? So they're saying they're going for political expediency. They're saying, well, taxes are unfair. So this particular tax, the way it's structured, so we are going to basically kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? We're going to make taxes more fair and we're going to save Social Security. Why I think you can make the argument that yes, taxes, the way they're structured, are unfair and we should change that. You do not want to stake the existence of Social Security and its soundness on your ability to raise the cap. Because what if you can't, right? Then you can't turn around and say, well, you're playing by their rules already, right? You're assuming that you have to raise the funds to pay for retirees. And the question then is, how do you raise the funds, right? So you've already given up the framing. You already adopted this conservative framing, the mainstream framing that taxes are paying for the retirees, right? And I think that's problematic. It might be politically expedient, but in the long term, that's not a winning proposition to go with that mainstream framing. And the reason why I brought up Alan Greenspan, and MMTers have done this many times before, is because Greenspan, in a testimony in front of Congress in 2005, he basically is asked by Paul Ryan, who's wanted to reform / cut Social Security for all of his life, basically. He says, well, what if we do this private retirement accounts, right? What if we privatize a portion of Social Security? Will that make the system more sustainable? And Greenspan says, well, there's nothing that prevents the U.S. government from just printing the money and paying the retirees. So he says in that financial terms, Social Security is not facing any problems. The real issue is, will you have any real assets to buy with that money that you've created? And that, like in that one clip that you can find on YouTube, he basically summarizes the MMT view on the sustainability of pensions, right? That it's not about money. The money can always be had. It's about whether you have the real resources to buy anything with that money, right? That should be the goal.
Can I just jump in here and just underscore something that I've heard Randy say, and Stephanie has definitely written it in articles, which is governments only spend one way. Because so when they say printing money, a lot of people use that pejoratively, printing, but what we're saying is money creation is the only way governments spend, and it's not controversial. That's anybody that looks at the payment system is, yes, that's how it happens. Every pound that the government spends into existence in the UK is spent into existence rather than spent out of some notional pile of cash.
But they know this, right? Or do they not know this, Yeva?
Well, in some sense, it seems like they know it and they don't know it at the same time, right? Because when needed, they will say these things, but as I think what Christian was trying to get at is that they present this as an option, right? That we have the option of printing money and paying for things. And this is often a misrepresentation of MMT, that MMT says, let's just print and spend, when, as you said, Christian, correctly, that this is how the government spends, right? It's not that we can, this is how we do it. And I just got out of class where I was showing my students this video of Jon Stewart talking to the former Federal Reserve chair of Kansas City, Thomas Hoenig. And you might have seen that clip where Jon Stewart says, why can't we just print money and pay our creditors like China? We give $1 trillion coin to China, another one to Japan, and then we pay off our debt. And Hoenig is trying to explain to him, well, we're just exchanging one IOU for another, that money is also debt. But because he doesn't understand what makes money a liability, right? The whole tax story that MMT tells, he doesn't know it. So he can't really explain it. And he also cannot explain that it's not an option. That's what we do, right? Jon Stewart says, let's print and pay off the debt. And if I were Hoenig, I would say, that's what we already do, right? But he doesn't understand that, right?
I was just going to say, just because we haven't done it in a few episodes, could you say that basic MMT story about assets and liabilities, what makes money as we know it?
So generally, people think that something is a liability if you can exchange it for something else, right? Like a government bond, it's easy to see that it's an IOU, it's a liability, because at some point it's going to be exchanged for currency, or a bank deposit, it's going to be exchanged for something else, right? Similarly, if we had a gold standard, you could say, well, what is it that the government owes you? They owe you a certain amount of gold for a certain amount of dollars, right? Once you don't have that, then people don't understand that the dollar is still an IOU, right? Those reserves are IOUs because there is no conversion into something else, right? At least they're a fixed exchange rate. So that's where the MMT story comes in. And it's not just MMT, it's also this credit theory of money. You know, what makes something debt is not the conversion into something else. It's the acceptability by the issuer, right? That debt has to be accepted by the issuer, right? That's what makes something debt. And in this case of the US dollars, is the taxes, which are the debt that are driving that.
What is really confusing about the whole argument about printing money? Because printing money means, I guess, printing reserves. I don't know exactly what it means to them, but
they're trying to say that there's a legitimate pool of money that existed at some time. We can't name when that time is, but that was legitimate. And then there's this extra sort of fake money that nasty governments add to it. And we can't tell the difference between the two.
But that's a remnant of monetarism, in a sense, isn't it? I mean, this idea. So there's a contradiction at the center of it, I think, that is that they believe that the quantity of money dictates prices, in a sense. And then at the same time, they accept that the central bank, in order to control inflation, has to control the price of money, not the quantity. And so they let the money float. But if you let the money float be created according to business activity, then what sets prices?
Yeah. There is a contradiction because on the one hand, mainstream economists would say, well, it's the quantity of money that drives inflation. And I've seen Mankiw say that at a conference where he was talking about MMT, saying, well, of course, the quantity of money drives prices. So it's not like something that they just say in textbooks, right? But then they also accept that the central bank does not control the quantity of money, right? That it's setting the price. And so there is that inconsistency. Okay, if inflation is about the quantity of money, but the central bank does not control the quantity, then how is the central bank even supposed to control inflation, right?
So what sets the quantity of money, if not prices?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can either control the quantity or the price as the monopoly issuer, right? So if you know they're controlling price, which is what monetary policy is, the quantity must be floating around that price that they're targeting every day, right?
Right. So when it comes to the monetary authority, right, they can't really control the quantity either. It's not like that's an option for them, right? And partly this stems from accepting bank IOUs as money, right? Monetizing bank IOUs in the sense that we give them FDIC insurance in the US, it's protection, right?
Which turns out to be quite important lately.
That's right. And then they have access to the lender of last resort. Again, that's been used more recently, right? And so because bank IOUs are treated as money, then banks can create money too, right? And if we're promising conversion of bank money to government money, then in that sense, the quantity of government money is not under our control either, because banks can create money which then can be converted. But I think the bigger point is that the quantity of money itself is not an important variable, right? It's the amount of spending that's important. That's what the mainstream sort of talks about the two as if they're the same thing when they're just not.
Yeah. So when people say, oh, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, I know that maybe a more accurate way to say that is if you're going to go down that, demand pull inflation route, then it's actually too much spending chasing too few goods, if you know what I mean, rather than just the quantity of money itself, or emphasize chasing.
That's exactly right. If you want to put it that way, then you would have to say that it's too much spending chasing a limited amount of goods rather than too much money. Because, yeah, the central bank can do a lot of QE. It's an asset swap, right? They buy the bonds, they inject the reserves, right? I used to have a bond, now I have a deposit. Doesn't mean I'm going to go out and spend it. It just does not make sense. So the central bank operates on the side of asset prices, portfolio allocation. When they change the interest rate, those changes are going to happen. I mean, Keynes recognized this, right? In the 1930s, if not earlier, that's what he says, right? That's why monetary policy is not that useful when it comes to, say, increasing or decreasing aggregate demand.
So having taken you down a money mechanics side road for a second, back to your articles, as you discuss in your articles, when it comes to thinking about state pension systems, wherever they are in currency issuing states, there are two important considerations. One is the dependency ratio and also worker productivity to take into consideration. Can you talk about those aspects?
Sure. So I noticed that there's a few themes that were in the news cycle at the time when I wrote the short piece on the French pensions. On the one hand, there were all these articles about how the countries, including France, but also the US, and other countries all over the world have to start worrying about their pension systems, about the affordability, because they would be running bigger deficits, because there is going to be more retirees who are collecting the benefits and they're living longer because of rising life expectancies. but there's fewer and fewer workers who are paying into the system. And all of that is framed in financial terms. So that was one thing that was in the news cycle at the time, and it still is to some extent. The other issue was the rise of artificial intelligence, right? AI, and what is it going to do? It's going to start replacing knowledge workers. White-collar jobs are not safe anymore, and so on. And now we have to worry about that. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't there a contradiction between these two?
Yes, absolutely.
So on the one hand, we're saying we're not going to have enough workers, and that's a problem. On the other hand, we're saying we're not going to have enough jobs for the workers we have because AI is going to replace quite a lot of these workers. And I'm thinking, if that's the problem that you have, the AI problem, why are you making people work longer? Like what France is trying to do, right?
Only one of them is real, right?
Right. Only one of these things can be true at the same time, right? Either you have too much of a productivity problem because of AI, or you have not enough workers, right? So then I looked at the French situation, and I've done that for the US, and I've looked at it for China as well, because China has been in the news about the population time bomb as well. And what I look at is, okay, the worker to retiree ratio is going to decrease, okay? But each worker is going to become more productive. So if you look at the past 30 years, right? And let's say in the past 30 years, the average French worker has become 40% more productive. And that's not very much, actually, because for the US, that number is 60%, right? So productivity has not grown as much as it could. And we can talk about why that might be the case. But then if the workers are going to be, say, 40% more productive 30 years from now, assuming this trend continues, right? And it's not a stretch to assume that, because the 40% number is not very high, right, for 30 years. So if that continues, then the number of workers that you currently have, right, or the number of workers you're going to have 30 years from now, if they're 40% more productive, they can produce more than the workers are producing today, right? So let me restate that. So if we have more workers today, we're going to have fewer workers per retiree in the future, okay? But because workers are going to be more productive, that effect is going to more than offset for the drop in that worker to retiree ratio. And the second aspect of this is that we're just looking at retirement, but ideally you should be looking at total dependency, right? Yes, we're going to have more retirees, but the flip side of that is we have fewer children to support, right? So workers of any society are always supporting all dependents, retirees and children alike, right? And so if you're going to have more retirees but fewer children, then your total dependency might not be increasing as much as if you're just looking at the aged dependency ratios.
And so back to Greenspan's testimony, and I mean, it was a real, it was great that gift came out of Paul Ryan, the sort of arch monetarist, libertarian, devil take the hindmost, trying to get Greenspan to give him a nice juicy soundbite, and Greenspan turns around and says, well, there's nothing to stop the government creating as much money as it wants. So in that testimony, which I believe that was in the 90s, was it? Or early 2000s?
2005, I believe.
2005, that's right, yeah. So in that testimony, Greenspan says, okay, it's all about, will the real assets be available in the economy, whether it's the US or the UK or France? Will the real assets be there for people to purchase, say, in 30 years' time? And what would you say policymakers could or should be doing now to ensure those real assets exist, or at least to give them the best chance of existing?
Yeah, so that's related to the question of productivity that we were just talking about, right? So if we have fewer workers, will these fewer workers be able to produce enough for everybody, for themselves and for those who are not working, including the retirees? And if the productivity continues to grow at the same pace, then the answer is yes, those real assets will actually be there. But to increase our chance, we could also say, well, how can we increase productivity further, right? And that's where you say, well, maybe we can look at why productivity has not grown as much as it could have, right? And I think one answer to why it hasn't grown as much is the austerity decades, I guess you could say, that we've had in the US, but especially in Europe. I think the UK is probably the hot spot right now for those kinds of policies, right? So if you do not keep aggregate demand high, right? If you don't have an economy where firms can expect demand to be there, then obviously they're not going to have an incentive to invest very much, right? Invest in new productive capacity, invest in research and development, right? We tend to think that worker productivity is about workers alone. I'm more productive than somebody else, right? The reality is that the technology that you're working with to a large degree determines how productive you're going to be, right? If you give me a faster, better computer, then I will likely be more productive than if you give me a 10-year-old computer, right? Something like that. So that's one thing. Can we invest more in our capital, physical capital? Can we invest more in research and development, right? Which can make our capital more productive, for example. On the question of human capital, can we invest more in education? Right? But everything we've been doing is the opposite. So France, instead of saying we need to invest more so we can keep our aggregate demand higher and we can encourage innovation, we can encourage investment, they're doing the opposite of that, right? They've been on an austerity streak like the rest of Europe and to some extent the United States, at least before COVID, right? And in case of France especially, their unemployment rate, the last time I checked, was 7%. So it's not just the workers that you have potentially, right? You're worried about your worker to retiree ratio, and yet you're wasting this scarce resource that you have, which are your workers, right? So it's not just the workers you have, it's also keeping them employed, right? Keeping them attached to the labor market, keeping your labor force participation rate high. Those are the kinds of things that we have to worry about, and not those financial considerations that everybody's worried about.
But in later years, I mean, when the whole Ukraine thing happened and the energy crisis started, and I believe central banks were pretty honest about the fact that monetary policy could do little about those supply side issues. And now when they talk about the wrongly blaming early retirement, but they still talk about it as if, well, that's not something monetary policy can really prevent. And yet they stop short at saying that monetary policy really can't do much in most inflationary scenarios.
Central banks are just very slow learners, aren't they? It's
Yeah.
just taking decades for them to figure out that they're obsolete.
That's right. So there was a headline in the New York Times just a few days ago saying something like this: Republicans blame the stimulus for inflation. They're blaming fiscal policy. The Fed chair disagrees. And he's saying that it's supply side issues. And I'm reading that and I'm thinking, so if you're saying it's supply side issues, then how can you not turn around and say there's nothing we can do about it, right? If there is anything we can do about it, is to keep interest rates low. So to allow interest rates to be permissive for investment that can alleviate those supply side pressures, right? So in some sense, I see there's two interpretations of the Fed. One is more benign than the other, I guess. So on the one hand, you can say the Fed was remarkably patient, and then they were under relentless attack by academic economists. It was unbelievable. People like Larry Summers, Jason Furman, right? They are constantly saying the Fed is doing too little, too late. And now that's the conventional wisdom that central banks should have started raising interest rates sooner, and that would solve the problem. When, of course, if you had the supply chain problems were much, much worse, right, earlier in the pandemic. So I don't know how raising interest rates was going to do anything about that, right? And so that's the sort of, I guess, more benign interpretation that the central bankers were resisting, and then they were pushed by economists. The other interpretation, which is less benign, is that the Fed has changed its policy framework. They said they were doing a review before COVID, actually. And sometime in August of 2020, they said, we're changing our policy framework. We're going to do flexible inflation targeting, okay? Which means that we're not going to try to achieve 2% every year. We're going to try to achieve an average inflation rate of 2%. Now, why do you think they might be doing that? And the reason was because they had been undershooting their target for more than a decade before that. So they were saying, if we keep undershooting our target, people are going to stop believing that we can actually control inflation. So we have to do something. We have to do something about it. And that something was to say, well, just because inflation is below 2% now doesn't mean we have to do anything now, because we are going to just allow it to be above 2% for a little bit at some point in the future. And that's why we're going to average the 2%, right? So they were saving their framework, even though claiming that their framework was new. So it was more like old wine in a new bottle kind of situation. And now they've cornered themselves, right? Because I think they are going to be in a bind going forward.
Fiddling with the numbers to make them work for them. So you mentioned just a moment ago about the effect of interest rates on investment. And I know that there's like a number of ways in which monetary policy is meant to impact demand and supply, and nobody seems to agree as to which effect is actually stronger and what the overall effect is. And Warren Mosler has a very strong opinion on that we've got it backwards, and that actually increasing interest rates is actually inflationary and vice versa. What are the effects on interest rate on investment, and what are your views on how that may or may not counter the effects that Warren Mosler talks about?
I just want to jump in and finesse what we're saying about what Warren is saying. Warren is saying with the debt level that they've got at the moment, basically, and there's that much outstanding, then in this environment, rate increases are going to add to aggregate demand, and that's going to outweigh other effects because the government debt ratio is so high.
I think there is a lot to that argument. I looked at some numbers a while back when Randy and I were writing our paper on the Build Back Better plan. And the estimate by CBO was that in this moderate increase to interest rates was going to inject something like 1.5% of GDP more in terms of interest spending into the economy. And the Build Back Better plans were like 2% of GDP. So we were just comparing to that, right, at the time. The question is how much of that actually gets spent, right? Because who earns that interest income? I think that's really the question. And I don't really know if there are any empirical estimates of that, but that would be an empirical question, right? Because it's the wealthy who own the bonds, right? A lot of it is not owned directly by households. It's owned by, say, pension funds, right? And they're not going to turn over all of that increase in interest rates to households for spending, right? It's going to be somewhat gradual, I guess I would say. So that's part of it. The other part is that not all of the debt is rolled over all at the same time. So it's not like all of the $30 trillion is now going to be refinanced at the new higher interest rates. It's going to be gradual as the debt matures. It will be rolled over at the new higher interest rates, right? So overall, the average rate that the government pays on its debt is going to go up, but it's not going to go up by 4 percentage points. So yeah, I think there is some stimulatory effect from the interest payments. And there is not a lot of empirical evidence that interest rate increases, at least the kinds that we have seen, are going to hinder investment very much, actually.
That's the effect that the orthodox economists are saying interest rates has.
Right. So they're saying that it's going to say, they're not even saying that, right? It's like, that would be a more coherent story to tell. And the reason why they're not saying it is because there's not a lot of empirical evidence to support that investment and spending in general is very sensitive to interest rates. So it's some kind of a convoluted story about expectations, that the Fed has to raise rates so that markets will continue believing that it's committed to fighting inflation. And so they will not increase their inflation expectations. And you're thinking, okay, but for markets to believe the Fed, they need to know that the Fed actually has the tools to affect inflation, right?
It's a circular argument again. It's like they need to believe that there's more than expectations to it.
Randy has said it turns out that expectations converge to reality rather than reality converging to expectations, funnily enough.
Yeah, Jerome Powell was in Congress and he was asked about it. And he says, well, if you believe something, it happens, something like that. And I'm like, that's basically your story about inflation, right? If you believe there's going to be inflation, there's going to be inflation. And in some sense, if you had like high rates of unionization, right, where workers were negotiating for contracts, let's say 3 years in advance, right, and they had to predict what the inflation rate is going to be 3 years from now, and they want to negotiate a contract 3 years from now that's going to be compensate their pay for inflation increases, right? Then maybe you could have that story, right? That inflation expectations become self-fulfilling because they get baked into contracts and so on. But that's not the world we live in. Nobody's negotiating. Like, I can't go to my employer and say, you know what? I think inflation next year is going to be 6%. So you have to give me a preemptive 6% raise. I mean, you're lucky if you get a 6% raise after the inflation has happened, right? We don't even get that. Wages are playing catch up.
I mean, we fight for as much as we can, regardless of the inflationary rate, surely.
Right. So it's a very strange argument. I think if you told it like in its basic form to a non-economist, they would say that's the reed you're hanging your whole policy on. I mean,
I think it really is the smartest guys in the room, quote unquote. And unfortunately, there's usually guys, isn't it? The smartest people in the room are saying, yes, we're going to fight inflation with vibes.
Yeah. And so that gets me back to this Fed reevaluating its own framework. They're saying, well, this unemployment inflation trade-off that we used to rely on does not hold anymore, right? So we are going to stop preemptively hiking interest rates, which was the one good thing to come out of that we're not going to look at the imaginary or the threat of inflation and just increase interest rates anyway. So they say we're not going to do that. They're saying all of these things that we used to base policy on, all of these relationships, they have changed, right? So we don't really know. Basically, they're saying we don't really know how inflation is generated, but this is still the policy we're going to use.
So talking about your pension system, Social Security in the US, you write, and I think this is a great way to put it, we don't earmark particular taxes to pay for the military, nor do we project how much it's going to cost 50 years from now. We don't forecast shortfalls in the military's funding many years into the future. The only reason politicians can even speak of a shortfall in Social Security's funding is because of the idiosyncratic way it is set up. Yeva, tell us about that setup.
Yeah, so in the US, and this is true to some extent in some other countries, we have particular taxes earmarked for the spending on Social Security, so spending for retirees. So those payroll taxes that I was talking about at the beginning, the one where Bernie Sanders wants to lift the cap, those taxes go into a trust fund, supposedly, right? The way we think of money going into a fund. So they go into a trust fund and then the retirees are paid out of that. And if the trust fund has a surplus, then we turn around and buy US treasuries with them. And then if the trust fund starts having deficits, then they will have to sell those treasuries, right? And then make up those payments that way. So it's set up very directly. But in other countries, you have similar things, right? So you're saying, well, particular taxes are supposedly paying for pension. But in the US, it's much more directly because it's like taxes on wages pay for Social Security. That's why they're called entitlements, right? We're entitled to it because we've paid into the system.
And I believe that was deliberate on Roosevelt's part, wasn't it? And
yes.
Stephanie Kelton writes about this in The Deficit Myth, that he felt that would be a way to protect Social Security.
Right. A way to protect it, but also a way to even pass the Social Security Act, because it's like the most conservative kind of way you can set up the retirement system. That's the way it was set up to get the votes in some sense. And progressive economists and even progressive politicians like Bernie Sanders today, they still feel that it does protect, that this setup protects Social Security because it makes it into an entitlement. And so that's why they would oppose economists like Dean Baker or Bob Pollin. They would oppose payroll tax cuts, right? So in a recession, if you want to cut taxes on wages, they would say, no. That's not the right policy, even though in a recession you do want to cut taxes, right? They would say that's not the right policy because you are underfunding Social Security. So they would make those arguments. And now they're saying we just have to raise the payroll tax cap so that we can continuously fund it. What I'm saying there is that, well, the reason why we can even say that there is a shortfall in Social Security is because we are doing this earmarking. That's one thing we're doing. We're also projecting how much Social Security is going to cost and how much of this particular tax we're going to collect 75 years into the future, what the dependency ratios would be. I mean, the kinds of assumptions you have to make to even get those estimates, right? We're doing all of that for this particular kind of government spending when there's nothing different about this spending compared to any other kind of government spending, like the military.
Yeah, because governments only ever spend one way. Even if you could point to a trust fund and say, look, that's where your money's gone. But I think that's a good way to think about it. That it's useful also that you've got this other, is it Medicare Part D or some other, because there are different schemes in the States. And the idea is that the law is that those benefits are guaranteed to be paid no matter what state the trust fund's in. And basically, when you project into the future, how solvent, how safe is this benefit? Surprise, surprise, it's solvent into the infinite future. So infinity and beyond, I think, is the way Professor Kelton puts it in her book.
That's right. One of those, and I don't remember which one, there's different trust funds for different obligations, basically, that the government has, because that's what these are, right? These are government obligations to the retirees or to survivors or to the people who are elderly who need healthcare and so on. Yeah, and one of those does not have the same kind of structure that, say, the Social Security Trust Fund has, right? And so in that case, you don't have a shortfall because you don't have the particular earmarking. You don't have to do the projections 75 years into the future, which is something that I think Social Security is mandated to do.
Yeah, because I think that's something that we probably need to workshop as progressives, is a way to talk about benefits and things like this. Because, I mean, our first episode, actually, me and Patricia, we were talking about, they were trying to introduce the idea of a hypothecated tax, because the NHS is very popular in the UK. And so this talking point comes around a lot. Okay, if we were to put a penny on your income tax or any tax and it was going to go to the nurses, which we know that's not how governments spend, thankfully now because of MMT, but if we were going to put a penny on taxes and it was going to go to the nurses and the doctors, would you vote for that? And that proposition is a vote winner every time somebody asks that question. Even the people to the right of centre, amongst Conservative voters in the last election we had, which the Conservatives won, even then they were like, there was 51% approval amongst Conservatives for that policy. So we like it and we think, okay, yes, this is a way to protect the NHS. Please tax us more. And so we were reading that story and thinking, we really need to start talking about this more, because it's not going to get us what we want. It's not going to get us a progressive economy and the pay for idea. And so I was just thinking we need to workshop different ways of talking about how things are funded. And you write in your article, instead of playing the game of how are we going to pay for it, progressives should strive to redefine the sustainability of social security in terms of real resources rather than finance. Do you have any thoughts on how to do that reframing?
Well, I think the first point I would make is that you have to be consistent, right? You can't say, well, right now, like this tax is popular, right? Like in case of your NHS tax or in case of the US lifting the cap on the payroll taxes, you say, well, it's politically popular, so I'm just going to hope that it will pass, because obviously things that are politically popular always pass, which is of course not the case. If that was the case, we would probably have a Medicare for all here, right? So they're going for that expediency, right? They're saying, well, it's popular, so we're just going to pass it, hopefully, and then attach our Medicare or our NHS's existence or the nurses' pay or Social Security to it, right? I think you have to be consistent. You have to say, well, yes, we want this tax because it's unfair to allow somebody who makes $200,000 to not pay it, while somebody who has $50,000 of income, they have to pay it. So that's and then it contributes to income inequality, right? So you have to approach it that way. That yes, we should do this tax, but it should be separate from what we're trying to do in terms of Social Security sustainability, right? So if you want that policy, if you think it's a good idea on its own, right, the policy should be able to stand or fall on its own merits rather than like tax policy, rather than whether you needed to pay for something. So in that sense, I think consistency is important. It's also important to be consistent when, say, the other side is pushing policies that you don't necessarily like. Like, think the Trump tax cuts. You could say the progressives and liberals in the US went for the argument it's going to raise the deficit. That's why it's a bad idea. But that's, of course, not the reason why it's a bad idea, right? The reason it was a bad idea was because the tax cuts were going disproportionately to the rich. It was going to exacerbate the income inequality problem. And so that's the line of attack that you should have adopted, right? You can't say, well, I'm going to ignore the deficits in one case, and then I'm going to say they're okay. And then in this other case, I'm going to say they're not okay. It's like it's the Democrats that bring back this ideal of the pay-fors in some sense. So you have to be consistent, whether it's policy you like or you don't like. You have to criticize it on its own merits. and then stay consistent on the financial framing.
I call it debt shaming.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Just so you ran up the deficit. No, you did. Or we'll run it up less. And it's like, wait a second. We need a bigger deficit. As Warren Mosler says, how do I know the deficit's too small? Count the bodies in the unemployment line.
It's trying to beat the right at their own game and doing it very badly.
And kind of trying to overdo it, because that's the way you try to beat them at their own game.
And trying to we need to appear like we're the very serious people in the room.
Yes.
Capital V, capital S, capital P. And that tends to be the way that the left of centre parties try and establish that credibility, which is a shame.
I mean, other than that, I really, frankly, do not know how you change the framing. I mean, the good thing is that we have MMT. It's out there. The ideas are out there. So I would say politicians would be wise to think of the long game, not do what is going to get you your results today, but might be hurting what you're trying to accomplish in the long term. You have to keep the eye on the long game and say, well, what is going to get me to a more progressive economy overall? And that obviously leads you to an MMT kind of framing, I would argue, right? But if even Bernie Sanders will not stand up and say that, I don't really know if there is any hope, frankly.
Well, you know what? I also think that 99.9% of us aren't politicians, right? So when we're looking at politicians, you go, you can get frustrated with Bernie for not saying what we'd ideally like him to say, or Jeremy Corbyn over here in the UK in terms of how government spend. We should also go, well, yeah, most of us aren't politicians, so we're allowed to say, actually, the national debt is nothing more than the pounds spent into existence by the UK government that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. We could say that. Okay, you're concerned about the debt. Well, this is what it actually is. Okay, take your curiosity and your concern all the way and fully understand what you're saying. When you say you want the government deficit to be cut, you're saying you want the private sector's net financial assets to be cut, or the non-government sector's net financial assets to be cut. Now, I know these aren't fantastic, wonderful things that if you were canvassing for the Democrats on doorsteps, or the Labour Party or the Green Party in the UK on doorsteps, they don't go down easy, but we're not there. We're not on the doorstep. We're trying to build little or big networks of people that are interested in this kind of stuff. And let's get the story straight. We can do it. We're not on TV in the firing line being barked down by some ideologue on Fox News. Let's take advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, educating people is one thing we can do, right? Well, hopefully we're doing it, right? And yeah, besides that, I don't really know what we can do.
Yeah, but just about your opinion on the continuing inflation, to what do you attribute it exactly? Because I think in the UK, for example, the COVID pandemic, every crisis that we've been going on has managed to even exacerbate the level of inequality in the country so much. And even here, we had the furlough scheme during the COVID pandemic, and workers received their wages even though they were not working. But a lot of that obviously went on rent and eventually ended up accumulating mostly on people that were rent seekers effectively. And it's really hard for me to believe that this inflation, that they're going to be able to maintain interest rates for very long, and that eventually they're going to have to reduce them back down because the level of inequality means there's going to be really low economic activity. Is that the same in the US?
Yeah, I think if you look at the stock market and the fact that it hasn't gone down by very much actually from its peak, in fact, it's 13% higher than it was before COVID. I think the stock market, that kind of pricing shows you that they do expect interest rates to go down very quickly. Otherwise, the higher interest rates could not sustain that kind of asset price valuation, I would say. Now, on the question of inflation, I think it's very interesting that it's been so persistent, right? And if you look at wages are playing catch up still, at least in the United States. So they're not the driving factor in this inflationary episode. And I think what needs to be appreciated more is that prices don't just happen. They are set by firms. And so the question is, how do firms set prices? They have their costs and then they have their markup, right? If their costs are not necessarily going up anymore because, say, oil prices are down and supply chains have normalized, right? Then I think the only explanation that you can have is that it's the margins that are driving it. And generally, I think businesses try to avoid changing their prices, right? The prices tend to be sticky, so to speak, or stable, which is puzzling for mainstream economists, but it's not puzzling if you think about it from a behavior perspective, right? They don't want to antagonize their consumers generally. They don't want to start price wars with their competitors. They don't want to raise their prices because they might end up losing market share. But if you have this cover of inflation and everybody's doing it, right? If your competitors are doing it, you're raising prices, they're raising prices. It's like everybody's collectively doing it. Then you don't have those issues anymore that you would consider in more normal times. Like, I'm going to lose market share or I'm going to antagonize my consumers, right? Everybody's doing it. I think that's giving firms more of a cover to raise their prices and raise their margins. But the question of profits is an important one, right? If you look at the macroeconomically, every dollar of government spending is going to end up as profits. That's how it's going to be. So government spending is in your profits equation, right? That's the Koletsky equation. So in some sense, it's like goes into the household pockets, but eventually ends up in the firm's pockets in the form of profits. So that part is not surprising. I think what's surprising is how quickly the corporations have been able to siphon all of that extra money that people got right into their profits, the speed at which they've been able to do it. That's what's amazing. And the reason why they've been able to do it so quickly is because of they're increasing their markups, right?
But that's unsustainable.
Well, that's true. It is unsustainable. And in some sense, the Fed, if you look at the Fed, Randy has a paper about this. When you look at their minutes, they always react to wage increases. And they say, well, if inflation is being driven by wages, we have to raise interest rates. But if it's coming from markups, we don't have to do it because it's self-limiting. That's the argument. I mean, in this case, it's gone on for longer than you would imagine. And perhaps that's because, at least in case of the US, people still had some savings because a bunch of people who didn't necessarily lose their jobs like me got stimulus checks. So they were able to build up some savings, which maybe they are still willing to spend. But the willingness of the American consumer to continue consuming in the face of increasing prices, it has been surprising, actually. And that goes back to the question of interest rates. If people continue consuming when the prices are 6-7% higher compared to last year, is raising the interest rate by 1 percentage point really going to dissuade them from consumption, right?
This brings us to another of your recent articles in The Hill, which is entitled "Lowering Inflation Isn't a Job for a One-Trick Pony." I think I know the pony you mean. Tell us about the pony and the one trick, and then maybe what other tricks policymakers could be using, and perhaps which other ponies.
Yeah, well, the pony is obviously the Federal Reserve or central banks, right, in general, and their trick is interest rates. In the US, there is this pretense that the central banks are these scientific, technocratic entities. They know what they're doing. They have these models which will tell them if you raise interest rates by 1 percentage point, inflation is going to come down by a certain amount. And that's actually how it works. The truth is very far from that, right? I'm sure they have their models. I'm sure they're very sophisticated. I don't know how useful they are, though, because everybody says, well, how much should the Fed raise interest rates? Who knows, right? So all these years spent on doing research on monetary policy, and yet we cannot answer that question. How high should interest rates go? How quickly should we raise them, right? Those kinds of questions. And that's all they got, right? People think of the Fed as if they are, I use the analogy of a surgeon, like they're operating on a patient with the different tools they have. The reality is they don't have different tools. They just have one, and it's like a hammer. And in some sense, it doesn't hurt when at the very low interest rate levels, but if you keep raising it, then you get financial repercussions like we see in the banking system in the US, is bearing that risk, that interest rate risk. Like there's been an argument, why wasn't this particular bank, Silicon Valley Bank, hedging their interest rate risk? And I'm thinking, if they're hedging it, it means somebody else is taking the risk. The risk doesn't just disappear, right? So they were hedging it, somebody else would be bearing it, and they would now be in trouble. So that's what happens when you raise interest rates. Asset prices get affected. In case of, say, the global financial crisis, we had a lot of adjustable rate mortgages. And when interest rates went up, those adjustable rate mortgages became unaffordable. Now, my understanding is that in case of the UK, you have a lot of adjustable rate mortgages. So if the Bank of England is raising interest rates, then obviously that's going to create a situation where the debts cannot be serviced anymore because they become unaffordable. So I think it's 2 points, right? That the interest rates are not very useful at affecting the price of output, but they can be very detrimental to asset prices, and that can have financial repercussions, right? It can have cash outflow repercussions, like if a household has to pay more on their mortgage because their interest rate has gone up, right? Then they might end up defaulting, for example.
I was just going to mention on the point of mortgages, I think at the beginning of all this inflationary episode, the Bank of England did a study about how many people had variable rate mortgages and all this. And they said things are fine because we won't get into trouble with the mortgages until rates hit 5%. They're at 4.25 now. Okay. So things are getting a little close for comfort.
In terms of the one trick pony, okay, so they wheel the pony out, it does the trick. we pat them on the head. And what other things should we be doing or encouraging policymakers to do? Or what should we be trying to encourage policymakers to try and sell us to try and get our votes?
So I think one important change we need to make, and I've written about this in the past, is that we need to stop putting the responsibility for inflation on the central bank, because that serves our elected leaders, actually, because you can't blame them for inflation. They say, well, they're all pointing the finger at the Fed. They're saying it's not our job, it's the Fed's job, right? And I think the first thing should be to say, no, it is actually your job, right? It's inconsistent to say that fiscal policy has raised aggregate demand. That's why we have an inflation problem. And then not also say, well, if that's the problem, why aren't you using fiscal policy to lower aggregate demand, for example? So if it's a demand problem, and I'm not saying it is, but if that's the argument, and the argument is that it's coming from fiscal policy, then why aren't you using the same policy? I mean, it just makes no sense, right? And with fiscal policy, you can obviously, if the goal is to reduce aggregate demand, you can do it in a more targeted manner where you are protecting families that are hardly making ends meet, that are living paycheck to paycheck, something that you cannot do with monetary policy. It's very blunt, right? And it actually hurts those who are borrowers who happen to be lower income, and it helps those who are earning income from, say, holding bonds, right? The rentiers that Keynes talks about. So it has those distributional impacts that you can try to actually correct with fiscal policy. So I would say you should put the responsibility on fiscal policy, which means you put the responsibility on the authorities. What can you do on fiscal policy fronts? I would say for the long term, right, it's clear that you have to make investments that will alleviate the bottlenecks that we know are always going to be the bottlenecks. They have been the bottlenecks like energy. In case of the US, it's housing. I mean, rents are through the roof. That goes into your CPI in some sense twice, because you have actual rental prices and then you have imputed rental prices, which are related to actual rentals. So, I mean, ideally, you could do some kind of rent control, right? But that's not going to happen in the United States. You could build more affordable housing, things like that. But I've also been thinking about this deferred compensation scheme that Keynes talks about in How to Pay for the War. He's saying, okay, you are in this war footing. You don't have enough for civilian consumption. Instead, you have to somehow constrain it, right? And he says, if you just rely on voluntary savings, it's not going to happen. People are going to try to spend, and that's going to lead to higher prices.
And just to remind anybody new here, when we talk about saving, which obviously, if this is your first time hearing about all this kind of stuff, you think, hey, what's wrong with saving? Well, it's great, but it's the opposite of spending. And if an economy or certain parts of the economy need spending because you've got unemployment, then you've got a problem. But then if you've got too much spending, chasing too few goods, then, you know, we're now talking about how to defer that consumption.
Yes. So the mainstream approach was at the time and is today that we're going to raise interest rates and that's how people are going to save more. While we see that that's not working clearly, right? So then Keynes is saying, okay, well, if we cannot rely on voluntary savings, what do we do? And he says we can try to do some kind of forced saving. And instead of taxing people's income away or raising interest rates where they're not paying more taxes, but they're paying more interest costs, right? So they're not better off in real terms, either way, whether it's a tax or a higher interest.
And that interest cost doesn't go nowhere as well. That's income for some other entity in the economy.
Exactly. And it's not necessarily the working class, right? It's those who actually have assets to earn any interest on. And instead of that, he says, why don't we force people to save, right? So we say, okay, we're going to take some of your income away today and we're going to give it back to you with interest after the war. So I've been thinking that you could, and in the US, we've done something similar with the war bonds that we said, well, we're going to try to encourage patriotic saving. We're going to try to make the denominations of bonds very small. So even your average working class person can buy them. And some bonds were actually off limits to banks, right? They were only available to households. So I've been thinking that if we could do something similar for the short term, right? Say, okay, if your family income is less than, say, 100,000 or 150,000, pick whatever cutoff you want. And if you're willing to buy this 5-year treasury security, we're actually going to pay you higher interest for it, right? So you could create some kind of special bond that's only available to households below a certain income level and is not available to banks. It's not available to pension funds, institutional investors in general, as a way to encourage people to delay their consumption. And if I were to do something like this, I would also add the option that people should be able, let's say if we have a recession between now and the next 5 years, right? In such a circumstance, you should allow the bonds to be redeemed earlier. So, I mean, I haven't thought too much about this, how to design it, but these are some sort of ideas of what you could do there.
If I may ask perhaps a very fundamental question, but that I realize that after all these episodes of MMT Podcast, I haven't asked this question of our guests. How could you explain why is inflation bad? And if it is bad, what rate of inflation should we be targeting, if any at all?
I think the mainstream overstates the dangers of inflation. For them, it's problematic because of the importance of the price system and resource allocation, and inflation is distorting that resource allocation, right? That's one factor. There are political factors. Inflation hurts creditors because the real value of the debt goes down, right? That's the political consideration. You might say maybe that's why we don't like inflation very much, right? But I don't think there is research that shows that if you have, say, inflation in the single digits, even if it's higher single digits, that's necessarily extremely detrimental for an economy. If you are coming from a developing country context, right, a 6% inflation would actually not be too bad. But I think the problem in the US is that, first of all, wages are not catching up to inflation. So in that sense, people's real standard of living is going down because of inflation, right? If you don't have any mechanisms to mitigate that, then that's a problem.
One such mechanism could be unions, right? The strongest they've probably ever been in this country is just before the dawn of neoliberalism.
Yeah, and the unions actually, that it's an important point. I think that's the reason why Paul Volcker in his book talks about breaking the air traffic controller strike in the United States. And he says that's the reason why we have been able to achieve moderate inflation, actually. That's what he says, saying that it's like by breaking the power of workers, right, or any organization, right, that's how we are able to. So that's really, like, he doesn't say that's one of the main ways they've done it. He's like attributing, of course, most of it to the genius of monetary policy, right? But I think the question of unions leads to another important point, which is liberal economists would say, well, the economy is doing well, right? The unemployment rate is less than 4% and people should be happy about it. And I'm like, well, it's doing well. First of all, two things. It's doing well because we had this jobless recovery after the financial crisis where the unemployment rate was 10%. So yeah, sure, relative to that, it's doing well. But the reason why people don't feel that the economy is doing well is because of the past 40 years, right? You can't understand the current economy in a vacuum. It's not just about this current cycle. Real wages have not really grown very much in the past 40 years. So back to the question of unions or the absence of unions. And so in that context where people's wages have not been going up, their standard of living has not been going up, they're not building any meaningful wealth, right, real or financial, then in that sense, right, just because the unemployment rate is low and they have a paycheck which hardly pays the bills, then it's not a surprise that people don't think the economy is doing very well. And obviously, the question of unions is related to the question of increases in real wages in line with productivity, like what we used to have before, say, the late 1970s in the US.
So on the question then of why inflation is bad, from what I've heard so far and from what you just said, the conclusion is it's not so much that the price of everything goes up that is bad, it's that prices don't go up together or don't move together. That's the problem. Because the subject of workers not liking inflation is pretty clear, but nobody seems to like inflation, not even the middle classes or even people with businesses. It's always everybody agreed that inflation is bad.
But that's why I always think it's never a bad thing to remind people that for nearly a decade, inflation was a target that was being undershot by central banks. They think 2% is good, actually. So in some respects, 2% inflation is good. That's what mainstream macroeconomists think, right? And so it's not necessarily inflation's bad. It's like we want to see low and slow inflation. And as long as we can point to CPI doing that, then we're doing our job. That's what the central bankers say. But then I think Yeva's point keeps getting lost in that. It's just like, hey, even if you're doing that, as workers, our real share of what we produce has been declining since the 70s.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like your workers, they're not protesting because you keep inflation low and then their wages are not really growing. So it's like everybody's just stagnating.
But you really have been getting poorer since the 70s. And that's not to do with inflation, actually. It's to do with your share of the pie. And so I think that's why mainstream thinkers, politicians, central bankers, political economists are really invested in keeping inflation in the headlines. You know, you read the business press and the only thing they care about is inflation.
That's a good point. So that you're saying the inflation narrative is weaponized, does that mean to justify the continued stagnation of wages?
Yeah, I would say, well, I mean, as long as we're talking about inflation all the time, even when we had low rates and low inflation, we're still not talking about, but we've still been getting poorer for going on for 5 decades.
One thing that I was thinking in that low inflationary episode is that if you asked people what the problems they were facing were, the cost of living always came up. That the increase in cost of living. And I was thinking, how can people say that when inflation is so low? And it occurred to me, it's not the inflation that they're capturing with that. It's the stagnating wages, really, right? Their wages are not going up. So they're saying, oh, everything is more expensive. Well, it's expensive if your income side of the ledger isn't changing, right? But on the question of, does anybody like inflation? I mean, if you look at corporations, for now, at least.
For now,
right? We will, I guess, live to see. But in their earnings calls with their investors, they're saying this is a great time for pricing. So they like all of these issues that they would deal with if they wanted to raise their price in any other environment, they couldn't do, and now they can, right? Like if the price of something went from $10 to $11, that's a 10% increase. But if you're not saying, oh my God, it's a 10% increase, you say, well, it's just $1. Like we're just going to raise it by $1. I think in any other time that might have been more difficult to pull off. And now they can do it. So for now, I think they are fine. Profits are high. That's another reason why the stock market is actually doing quite well, despite everything, despite higher interest rates and so on, because corporate profits have been very healthy, to say the least.
Okay, so to circle back to where we started, Yeva, if you were advising the activists in France now about how to think about pensions from an MMT perspective, what framework, what talking points would you say to help them advance their mission to keep their living standards such as they are, or God forbid, even improve them?
Well, I think the activists in France or the leftist economists, my understanding is that they're making the same mistake that Bernie Sanders is making here. They're saying, well, the government is exaggerating the situation, the finances are not as bad, and that the finances are actually much better, that it's not so bad. Again, that's the wrong approach, according to me, right? That's like you have already accepted the terms of the game, and those terms are wrong. And so there is no way you can win. Okay, today they're not so bad, but what about 5 years from now? 5 years from now, are they going to be bad? And then you can then go back and say, well, like if you're going to go with that same framing, then you're going to say, okay, now we have to cut the pensions or we have to raise the retirement age, right? So I would say, okay, if you are a country like France, you say, no, what do we do to increase our productivity? Why hasn't our productivity gone up as much as it has in the US, right? Or some other economies, right? So that's the question. Why do we have such high unemployment rates? How can we put these people to work so that they can create those resources, the infrastructure that we need for our retirees, like the care work and all of that we need, right? So those are the kinds of things that you should say. It's like if you ask for a little, you get even less. So instead of saying, we're going to accept the framing and we're going to say, no, don't cut our benefits because financially we're okay. No, instead you say, no, not only should you not cut benefits, but you should also increase government spending on education, infrastructure investment, research and development, these kinds of things. You should increase aggregate demand to keep tight full employment and so on and so forth. So you should be asking even more, right? Rather than just going with these weak kinds of demands like don't raise the retirement age, which is effectively a pension cut.
Go for gold to get the silver, basically.
Maybe go for platinum to get the platinum, because everything you just said there, Yeva, about keeping aggregate demand high, tight full employment, that goes to that point of that's how we ensure that we've got those goods and services in 30 years' time for the retirees.
Right. And obviously you cannot know what you're going to need exactly 30 years from now, right? So you can't produce care work and save it, but you can say, oh, we are clearly going to have a shortage of care workers. We're clearly going to have, at least in the US, we're going to have a shortage of care workers. We're going to have a shortage of medical workers. What can we do today? What kind of investments in human capital can we make today to prevent those shortages?
Because these are the things that they cut. I mean, I think I'm channeling Warren Mosler from about 12 years ago saying that there's not a lot you could put away today that's going to have value in 50 years' time. Like if 50 years ago they put a car in a garage and you pull it out today, it's not worth the whole lot unless it's got value as a curiosity or as a collector's item or something like that. But what does gain in value is your know-how, your software, stuff like that. And those are the things that are being cut. They're cutting education. They're cutting people's access to education. And I just think this is a solid argument for let's ramp up on those things precisely because of what you said, Yeva. We don't know what we're going to need, but we're going to need people to solve interesting and perhaps hard problems. So let's get smart.
Right. And obviously that's where we come back to the question of our artificial intelligence, right? And I mean, obviously maybe AI is not going to take care of grandma, but what else can AI do? And here it's, I think one thing I've been thinking about is who's going to decide how that's all going to play out, right? Right now in the US, it's all in private hands. The artificial intelligence technology, which can be so groundbreaking, there is no public control over how that's going to be deployed, for what purposes. And that scares me.
Aren't there a couple of court cases going on? I think I've heard of, particularly on the artists' side, a few artists have gathered together to sue these AI companies because they perceive that as stealing copyright on a mass scale. Right. So I really hope they win because I think they have a really good case. But that will have a huge impact, I guess, on what kind of applications AI is allowed to be used for.
Right. And I think my point was more like if we can harness the technology for the public purpose, for the public good, but we're not really trying to do that. So I think at the most, we're trying to prevent AI from, say, taking some of our jobs, right? If there is any attempt, that's where it's going for now. But I think over the long run, that's going to be a losing proposition. Maybe the artists will be safe. I don't know about my job.
So we're trying to mitigate the worst aspects of it, but we're not really trying to do anything constructive with it.
Okay. Sounds a bit like nukes. Anyway, let's not get depressed about that. So before we go, Yeva, and I think your job is very safe, actually, in my humble opinion. We've got the article on Greenspan and Social Security to look forward to when that comes out. But are there any other things in the pipeline, papers or events or anything else that listeners should look out for?
We have a paper with Randy Ray coming out as a Levy working paper, which addresses some of those themes in my potentially, hopefully, op-ed on the Greenspan path to reforming Social Security. And I don't even know if it's going to be published as an op-ed because it's obviously very controversial, even for progressives, right? But we have a paper on aging, the so-called unbearable weight of aging and the population time bomb and how to deal with that, where we make these MMT arguments about the US, about China, because China has been in the news a lot about how it's going to decline, how it's going to get poor before it's able to take care of all of its population. So we address those things. So there's a working paper coming on Levy. I don't know when exactly, but at some point, maybe in the next month or so.
Great. Well, we look forward to talking to you about that whenever you can fit us in. Well, that's a great place to leave it. We've been talking to Professor Yeva Nersisyan, Associate Professor of Economics at Franklin and Marshall College, and, by the way, contributor to the recently published MMT Key Insights Leading Thinkers. We'll link to where you can get hold of that book in the show notes for this episode, along with a link to where you can get free tickets to the launch of that book, which will feature author presentations and heavily discounted books. That takes place in London on the 20th of April. Me and Patricia will be there. We hope to see you guys there. But for now, thanks so much for joining us once again today on the MMT podcast, Professor Yeva Nersisyan.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.